unit is going to be not only learning the theory and all the different things that we learn about electrical and components and so forth, is how to make it a wiring repair. The probably most adequate wiring repair we can make is to solder a wire together. Yes, they make different types of connectors out there, and depending on what you're trying to do, those may be adequate also. But typically speaking, a good solder joint is going to last longer and be a better repair than like a butt connector, where we're just sliding two wires in and crimping it. The solder joint joins the metals together, and then we will put a piece of shrink wrap over it that will seal that joint to keep moisture, debris, and things out of there that would cause damage or corrosion to the wire over time. So what I'm going to do is show you how I go about doing it. Many of you are in a point right now that you're kind of in limbo between projects and so forth. So I suggest you come up here, practice a skill. This will be one of the first grades that goes into the grade book for the next try. Okay? The idea behind this is to practice a skill, get good at it, and then when you've got it figured out, you're going to bring me the finished product, and I'm going to put a grade in the grade book for you. So to practice this, we don't need a whole bunch of wires. So let's be somewhat frugal with our wire here. I have a ruler here. You can take about 4 inches would be sufficient. About a 4-inch piece of wire. Don't need a real big piece of wire. Cut it in half. And then you can strip that wire. Find the right size wire strippers. Pull off the insulation. Okay. Now there's multiple different ways to join these wire strands together. Depending on, you can get on YouTube and see lots of different things where people do it various different ways. I'm going to show you the way that I prefer to do it. I think it works quite well. So we just kind of open this up and spread these strands out, okay? We get these strands spread out. We're just going to slide them together and give them a good twist. Now, what we want to see from this is we don't want to see any little strands sticking out. We don't want the little edges of those sticking out of there because they make sharp points. So I'm going to pass this around real quick so you can get a good look at it. Obviously, if you tug on it, it's going to pull it apart because there's nothing really holding it together. But if you look closely at it, we don't see any little edges and little strands that are poked up. Making its way around. Okay, so you can see that's a pretty smooth transition between the two pieces of wire. Now, what I have here is just this little magnetic alligator clip thing. All this is a wire holder. It's to make your life easier. Because what you'll find when you start soldering these things together, trying to hold on to all this stuff, having one of these little tools is great. They're magnetic. You can hold it in place. My suggestion to you is get comfortable. Okay? The next thing we need to talk about before we start into the whole soldering process is types of solder. There are many different types of solder out there. Many of you have probably worked with solder in some degree, somewhere along the way, doing some plumbing or maybe possibly some sort of radiator repair. There's lots of different types of solder. What we use for electrical repair is called rosin core solder. Okay. The other most common type of solder out there is called an acid core solder that is usually used for plumbing applications and different things. Some solders have lead, some solders are lead free. This is an alloy. What does an alloy mean? What's that? Maybe something metal. The what? Mixture of metals. This one is 63% tin and 37% lead. It is 0.32 diameter, means it's 32 thousandths of an inch in diameter, relatively thin solder. This is what we use for, this is a type that we would use for doing typical soldering joints on a machine automobile. You get into great big fat wires, obviously you're going to need a large heat source and a much larger piece of solder. But for typical purposes of in our environment, what we're doing, this is very adequate. You're going to find tubes of solder like this at the hardware store, local auto parts store, things like that, okay? So rosin core solder, it does have a lead aspect to it. So certainly, I mean, we're not eating this stuff or using this to solder pop cans together or whatever. So you notice I have a certain amount of it pulled out of here and I have it on a 90-degree angle. The reason I do this is just for ease of usage. You can use this like a little handle. I put my finger over the end of this because this thing will sit here and spin. Put your finger on it, you have a little more control. Because what we want to do is we want to heat the wire. And when the wire gets good and hot, it's going to draw the solder into it. We're not trying to melt the solder on top of the wire. We're going to heat the wire and it'll draw it in. So you guys are going to have to kind of get close to see what I'm doing here. I have a soldering iron here. It's quite hot. A lot of times I will test it to see if it's up to 10. I'll just put a little touch of solder to it. We can see it melted it very easily. The other thing is, if you pull one of these things out and it's got a bunch of junk on that tip, it would be a good idea to take a wire brush and clean it off so we can get good heat penetration through it. We don't want a bunch of stuff on it holding it back. So you can see I'm just holding it on the wire strands. And depending, obviously, the thicker the wire, the longer you're going to have to hold it, the longer it's going to take to penetrate the heat in there. Just holding it there. A lot of times I'll come up here and I'll just put a little on here and get it started, and then try to pull it up to the wire. And you can see I'm just putting it right on the wire. If you're close enough, you can see it's just drawing it right into the strands of the wire. I'm not moving the soldering iron. I'm just kind of working the solder back and forth across these portions of it, just like that. Now, good solder joint. When you're done with a good solder joint, it's going to be nice and smooth. You're not going to have a big glob of solder on here. You're not going to have a big ball on here, okay? It's going to be nice and smooth. You should be able to roll it around and see where it's drawing it through all the little strands. It's still a little bit warm, but it's not too bad. And obviously, it shouldn't pull apart. And this one's not pulling apart. We don't have any of the strands of the wire poking out. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a minute. And we can see that the solder is all the way through. So I'm going to pass this around and get a good look at this. This is how it should look when you're completed. All right, now that you've made a good soldered joint and everything's held together, now, just like a wire, it has insulation over the outside of it to protect the internal portions of it. We need to put a covering on it. And this covering, we're going to use shrink wrap for this covering. This shrink wrap comes in many different sizes and colors and so forth. We can get it anywhere from very, very small, even smaller than this, up to just extremely large pieces of shrink wrap. We obviously need to fit it somewhat to the diameter of the wire. If the shrink wrap's too small, the wire's not going to fit through it. I think we can figure that out. If the shrink wrap is too large, it's not going to adequately shrink down around the wire. Therefore, it's going to leave openings for water and debris and different things to get in there. So we got to find one that's relatively close to the proper size. And then when we slide this on, we want our solder joint in the middle. So when this shrinks down, it doesn't expose any of the wire. Also, this is where it comes in that it's very important that when we start with that, when we twist it together, we don't have any of the little strands sticking up. If we have a little strand sticking up here, they're extremely sharp. When you shrink this down, it's going to poke a hole in this. And in place it pokes a hole in it, it's going to allow a spot for things to try to enter in. So I'm going to put our shrink wrap on here, center it up the best we can. Go ahead and put it back in our little holder. And we have a heat gun here. We can use this. We could even roll this across it and shrink it down, but we're going to use the heat gun for what we're doing. Doesn't take real long for this to warm up. And what we're looking for is it to pull down nice and uniform all the way around it and make a good seal. We don't want any spot of it not shrunk. Okay. So when we're done, it should pull down nice and uniform. We shouldn't have a spot where it's really like balled up. And we should also see where it pushes out the glue on the ends of it. There's a little bit of glue to help seal it. This is what a good solder joint covered in shrink wrap should look like. I have two of them here. I got one from this morning when I did it. Here's another one. Very clean solder joint. Not much larger in diameter than the rest of the wire. This is what we're after. This is a good solid solder joint. It's going to stay together. It's sealed up good. It's going to keep moisture. I mean, this is, for all practical purposes, it's just as good as the wire. In our application, especially with our machines and even our automobiles, being in the demographics of where we live, the machines, whether it's farm equipment, construction equipment, they're in dirty, nasty environments. There's lots of dirt and water and things that these machines are working in. Our automobiles, they use a lot of chemicals on the road to fight the snow and the ice and so forth, and them chemicals are very corrosive. We can see that in our vehicles. So it's very important that when we make a wiring repair that we make sure it's an adequate repair, that we can keep the elements out. Copper is a soft material. Most of our wires are made out of copper. It's a very soft material. It's not going to take a lot of corrosion to cause damage to it. Now you go through the effort to do a good diagnosis and find a problem within a wiring. You find a broken wire or something somewhere, and to just arbitrarily throw a butt connector or something in there to get them back together. Yeah, did you fix it? Yes, you fixed it. But how long is that repair going to last? A few weeks, few months, a couple years, who knows? It's going to be dependent on what kind of environment it's subject to. I had a question this morning about wire nuts. How many people know what a wire nut is? They are not used in automotive or equipment repairs. That is strictly a thing used for home wiring. Typically used on home wiring that uses solid core wires. Typically, I'm not going to say always, but typically when we're dealing with home wiring, usually it's inside. We don't have that worry of the elements in these different things that can get to them and affect it. So a little different scenario. I do see them from time to time on machines and on automobiles and stuff. No, they're They're not intended for that. Putting butt connectors on and wrapping them with electrical tape. No, it's not adequate. Water, salt, that stuff gets beyond the electrical tape, gets down to the butt connectors. I do know there's some butt connectors out there that have solder in them and have shrink wrap on them. They're a little bit better. Still not as good as one of these.